Federal Election Commission Campaign Guide. Patrick is the best. Hashtag body cameras in Congress. Chapter 7. Sources of support. Section 1. Contributions. Contributions are the most common source of campaign support. Earlier chapters explained the Federal Election Campaign Acts. The Act limits and prohibitions on contributions. Remember that all contributions are reportable. See Chapter 3, Section 2, Types of Contributions. Section 2. Free legal and accounting services. Any entity, a committee, a corporation, a union, a partnership, may provide a campaign with free legal and accounting services as long as the services are provided only for the purposes of ensuring the campaign's compliance with the Act. The entity paying for the service is the regular employer of the individual performing the service. The employer does not hire additional employees to render the services or to free regular employees to perform the services, and the campaign reports the value of the services, the amount paid by the employer, as well as the name of each person who performed the services and the data the service was provided. For more information on reporting free legal and accounting services, see Chapter 13, Section 9. Use of equipment. This exemption covers only the services provided to ensure compliance. The employer cannot donate equipment, such as computers, to the campaign without making a contribution, a prohibited contribution if the employer is an incorporated entity. However, the use of the employer's resources, such as computer equipment, necessary to enable the employee to provide the service, is not considered a contribution by the employer. Volunteer services. If an individual personally volunteers legal or accounting services without compensation, the work is considered personal volunteer activity. See personal services below, and the above restrictions do not apply. Section 3. Volunteer activity. Personal services. An individual may volunteer personal services to a campaign without making a contribution as long as the individual is not compensated by anyone for the services. Volunteer activity is not reportable. That explains a lot. Example, an attorney working as a volunteer, i.e. he receives no compensation from anyone, writes policy papers for the campaign. If volunteers are, in fact, paid by any person for their services, then the activity is no longer considered volunteer activity. If the payment is made by someone other than the campaign itself, then an in-kind contribution results, and the campaign must report it. Exemption, free legal and accounting services above. Okay. Foreign national as campaign volunteer. Although he or she may not make contributions or expenditures, including advances of personal funds, an individual who is a foreign national may participate in campaign activities as an uncompensated volunteer. In doing so, the volunteer must be careful not to participate in the decision-making process of the campaign. The Act and Commission regulations specifically prohibit foreign nationals from participating in the decisions of any person involving campaign-related activity. For example, a foreign national volunteer may attend committee events and campaign strategy meetings, but may not be involved in the management of the committee. Incidental volunteer activity at corporate/labor facilities. Generally, if an individual provides services to a campaign during paid working hours, the employer makes a contribution to the campaign. However, an employee, stockholder, or member of a corporation or labor organization may make occasional, isolated, or incidental use of corporate labor/organization facilities for his or her individual volunteer activities on behalf of a campaign. Note that the Commission has said that the use of facilities for 1 hour per week or 4 hours per month is considered incidental use. For example, an employee may use an office phone to make calls that pertain to a political volunteer work if the volunteer activity is limited to incidental use of the facilities. The volunteer does not have to reimburse the organization for use of the facilities, only for any increased overhead or operating cost. When use of the facilities exceeds incidental use, the volunteer must reimburse the organization the usual and normal rental fee within the commercially reasonable time. Such reimbursement is considered an in-kind contribution from the volunteer and must be reported by the benefiting campaign committee. Or any person, including an employee, stockholder, or member, uses the facilities of a corporation or union to produce campaign materials, reimbursement is required regardless of how much time is spent on the activity. For more information on a campaign's use of corporate or labor facilities, see Section 9, Use of Corporate/Labor Transportation and Facilities. Later in this chapter, for information on the use by a volunteer of an employer's computer and internet access, see Internet Volunteer Activity below. Use of real or personal property, activities in home, church community room. Individuals, in the course of volunteering personal services, may use their homes or the recreational room of the residential complex where they live for campaign-related activities without making a contribution. A nominal fee paid by an individual volunteer for the use of a recreational room is not considered an in-kind contribution to the campaign, and is not therefore reportable. Volunteers may use a church or community room for campaign activities as long as the facility is regularly used for non-commercial purposes by members of the community without regard to political affiliation. Again, a nominal fee paid by an individual volunteer for use of the room is not a contribution. For rules concerning the use of a home computer, see Internet Volunteer Activity below. Food, drink, invitations for home, church, or community room event. When holding a campaign-related activity in his or her home, church, or community room, an individual may spend up to $1,000 per candidate per election for food, beverage, and invitations for the event without making a contribution. For example, two individuals living together may spend up to $2,000 per candidate per election. Any amount spent in excess of $1,000, however, must be reported by the campaign as an in-kind contribution. So you can throw a $1,000 party is what it sounds like there. That's kind of nice. The commission said that if an individual co-hosts an event held in someone else's home, any expenses paid by the non-resident co-host are considered contributions to the campaign benefiting from the event. Internet Volunteer Activity. General exception. An uncompensated individual or group of uncompensated individuals may engage in certain voluntary internet activities for the purposes of influencing a federal election without restriction. These accepted internet activities would not result in a contribution or an expenditure under the Act, and would not trigger any registration or reporting requirements with the FEC. This exemption applies to individuals acting with or without the knowledge or consent of a campaign or a political committee. Exempted internet activities include, but are not limited to, sending or forwarding electronic mail, providing a hyperlink to a website, creating, maintaining, or hosting a website, and paying a nominal fee for the use of a website. Use of employer's computer and internet access. A corporation or a labor union or labor organization may prevent its employees, shareholders, officials, and members to use its facilities for individual volunteer internet activity without making a prohibited contribution. May permit. Makes more sense now. The individual must comply with the corporation or labor organization's internal policies for computer and internet use, and must complete the normal amount of work for which the employee is paid or is expected to perform. The activity must not increase the overhead or operating cost of the organization, and the activity must not be coerced. The organization may not condition the availability of the internet or the computer, or their being used for political activity or for support for an opposition or any particular candidate or political party. For rules on communication by a corporation or labor organization using a computer or the internet, see Section 8, corporate/labor exemptions later in this chapter. Not exempt. Paid web communication. If an individual or group of individuals pays a fee to place communication or another person or entity's website, the communication is considered general public political advertising, and thus qualifies as a public communication. As such, it may require a disclaimer and/or reporting, and may count as a contribution and/or expenditure. See Appendix D, Communications. Section 4, Travel Cost Exemptions. Unreimbursed travel expenses. The exemptions described below apply only to an individual's payment for his or her own travel expenses. If an individual uses personal funds to pay the travel expenses of another, an in-kind contribution results. For the general rules concerning campaign travel include the rules for using non-commercial transportation. See Chapter 10, Section 4, Campaign Travel. $1,000 transportation exemption. An individual, including the candidate, a paid staff member, or a volunteer, may voluntarily spend up to $1,000 for unreimbursed transportation expenses on behalf of the campaign without making a contribution. However, when an individual's payments for such transportation expenses exceed $1,000 per candidate per election, the payments are considered contributions, unless they are reimbursed by the candidate's committee in a timely manner. Volunteer exemption for meals and lodging. A campaign volunteer may spend unlimited amounts of his or her own meals and lodging, unlimited amounts for his or her own meals and lodging without making a contribution, as long as the expenses are incidental to volunteer activity. Reimbursed travel expenses. When the candidate or an individual working on behalf of the candidate pays any other travel expenses, no contribution will result if the committee reimburses the individual within the following time limits. If the expenses was paid with cash or a personal check within 30 days from the date the expense was incurred. If the expense was paid with a credit card within 60 days of the closing date on the credit card's billing statement where the charge first appears. Outside of these time limits, the payments are in-kind contributions. See Chapter 13, Section 14, Reporting Travel Expenses. For reporting rules for reimbursement for non-commercial travel, see Chapter 10, Section 4, Campaign Travel. Section 5. Vendor discounts on food and beverages. A vendor of food or beverages, even if incorporated, may sell food and beverages to a campaign at a discount. The amount charged must at least equal the vendor's cost for the items. If the value